The old soldier's hand trembled as he unfolded the yellowed paper. 60 years had passed, but the simple drawing still made his throat tight. It wasn't a map. It wasn't a military secret. It was something far more powerful. A Japanese woman who couldn't speak a word of English had drawn something in the dirt that broke through every wall the war had built between them. And when he finally understood what it meant, Private Daniel Harper fell to his knees and wept. September 1945. The war was over. But for Private Daniel Harper, nothing felt finished. The humid air of the Philippines clung to his uniform as he stood guard outside the makeshift prisoner of war camp near Manila. Around him, hundreds of Japanese civilians and soldiers waited in uncertainty. The surrender had been signed aboard the USS Missouri just weeks ago, but the wounds were still fresh, still bleeding. For Harper, those wounds ran deeper than most. His younger brother Michael had been killed at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. He was only 19 years old, fresh out of high school, serving on the USS Arizona. Michael had written home about how beautiful Hawaii was, about the friends he'd made, about the future he was planning. 2 weeks later, he was dead, incinerated in the explosion that tore his ship apart. Harper had carried that anger across the Pacific, through Guadalcanal, through Saipan, through Okinawa, battle after battle, island after island. To him, the enemy wasn't human. They were the reason his mother cried herself to sleep every night. They were the reason his father had aged 10 years in one day. They were the reason his family's kitchen table had an empty chair that nobody could bear to remove. The camp was chaos. Displaced Japanese nationals, former soldiers, nurses, teachers, merchants, farmers, all crammed together in a fenced area that had once been a Catholic schoolyard run by Spanish missionaries. The buildings were damaged from American bombing raids, walls cracked and pockmarked with bullet holes. The U.S. military was trying to organize them, to process them, to figure out who went where and who could be trusted. But communication was nearly impossible. Most of the prisoners spoke no English. Most of the American soldiers spoke no Japanese. There were a handful of Nisei interpreters, Japanese Americans who had proven their loyalty by serving in the U.S. military, despite their families being locked in internment camps back home. But there weren't enough of them. So most interactions happened in silence, through gestures, through fear and confusion and desperate pantomime. Harper didn't want to be there. He'd requested a transfer back to combat operations, anywhere there was still fighting. But the war was over. There were no more combat operations. The last shots had been fired. The last bombs had been dropped. So instead of fighting, he found himself distributing water rations and standing watch over people he still considered enemies. His friend, Corporal Frank O'Brien, tried to lighten the mood. O'Brien was from South Boston, quick with a joke, always trying to find the humanity in things even when everything seemed dark. He'd crack wise about the food, about the officers, about anything to get Harper to crack a smile. But Harper wasn't interested in smiling. And he definitely wasn't interested in finding humanity. Not when it came to them. One afternoon, as the tropical sun beat down mercilessly and the humidity made it feel like breathing through wet cotton, Harper was assigned to escort a group of female prisoners to the medical tent. There were 12 women, all painfully thin, all exhausted, their clothing torn and dirty and patched with whatever fabric they could find. They moved slowly, shuffling their feet, keeping their eyes down, avoiding any direct contact with the American soldiers. Harper walked behind them, rifle slung over his shoulder, face hard as stone. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. They knew where to go. They'd learned quickly that silence and obedience were the safest options. But one woman stumbled. She was small, even by Japanese standards, maybe 5 feet tall if that, with short black hair that looked like it had been cut with a knife, and a face that might have been pretty before months of malnutrition had hollowed her cheeks and darkened the circles under her eyes. She caught herself before falling completely, her hands scraping against the rough ground, but the effort left her breathing hard and trembling. Harper stopped. The other women stopped too, looking back nervously, afraid of what might happen. The woman who had stumbled slowly pushed herself back to her feet. She looked up at Harper, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Hers were dark brown, filled with exhaustion, and something else Harper couldn't quite identify. Not fear exactly. Resignation maybe. Acceptance of whatever fate had in store. She bowed slightly, an automatic gesture of apology deeply ingrained in her culture. then continued walking on unsteady legs. Harper felt nothing, or at least he told himself he felt nothing. He told himself she was just another prisoner, just another enemy who happened to be suffering the consequences of her nation's choices. He told himself that whatever pain she felt, it couldn't compare to what she and her people had caused. But somewhere deep inside, in a place he didn't want to acknowledge, something shifted uncomfortably. At the medical tent, the women were checked for diseases, given minimal treatment for malnutrition, dehydration, and the various injuries that came from surviving in the jungle for months. The American medics worked efficiently but without warmth, doing their jobs but maintaining professional distance. Harper stood outside, smoking a cigarette, watching the camp, trying not to think about the woman who had stumbled. That's when Sergeant Thomas Nakamura approached. Nakamura was a Nisei, born in Sacramento, California, to Japanese immigrant parents who ran a small grocery store. He'd been serving as an interpreter for the past 3 months, translating interrogations, processing paperwork, helping to sort through the mess of displaced persons. Harper had never spoken much to him. There was an awkwardness there. Nakamura was Japanese by blood but American by birth and choice. He'd volunteered to serve even while his own parents were locked behind barbed wire in an internment camp in Arizona. Harper didn't know how to categorize him, didn't know how to reconcile the contradiction, so he just avoided him when possible. Nakamura nodded at Harper, his face professionally neutral. He said one of the women inside was asking about her identification papers. She'd lost them during the bombing of her village north of Manila. Without papers, she couldn't be properly processed. She couldn't be sent home. Not that there was much of a home to go back to. Most of Japan was in ruins. Nakamura asked if Harper had found any documents in the area where she'd been picked up 3 days ago. Harper shook his head. He hadn't found anything except starving people hiding in the ruins. Nakamura thanked him politely and went back inside the tent. Later that evening, as the sun set in brilliant oranges and reds that seemed obscene given the misery all around, Harper was sitting outside his tent, writing a letter home. He wrote to his mother every week, a promise he'd made before shipping out, but he never knew what to say. He couldn't tell her about the things he'd seen, the things he'd done. He couldn't tell her about the nightmares that woke him up screaming. He couldn't tell her about the Japanese soldier he'd killed in hand-to-hand combat on Okinawa, a boy who couldn't have been more than 16, whose face Harper still saw every time he closed his eyes. So instead, he wrote about the weather, about O'Brien's bad jokes, about the terrible food, about how he hoped to be home by Christmas. Safe things, empty things, lies that let his mother sleep at night. O'Brien sat down next to him, holding 2 lukewarm beers they'd traded for with some Navy guys who had access to the supply ships. He handed one to Harper, and they sat in silence for a while, just drinking and watching the camp settle into evening routines. Finally, O'Brien spoke. He said he'd been talking to Nakamura earlier. He said most of the women in the camp weren't soldiers or even war supporters. They were teachers, nurses, shop workers, seamstresses. They'd been trapped in the Philippines when the war started, cut off from home, unable to leave. They'd spent years in hiding, in fear, watching their world collapse around them. Some had watched their husbands or sons forced into service with the Japanese military. Some had been abused by Japanese soldiers who saw them as expendable. O'Brien said it was sad when you really thought about it. All those lives just destroyed by decisions made by men in Tokyo and Washington who would never face the consequences themselves. Harper didn't respond. He didn't want to think about it. Thinking about it made things complicated, and he needed things to be simple. They attacked Pearl Harbor. They killed Michael. They were the enemy. That was simple. That was clear. That was a narrative he could live with. But over the next few days, Harper kept seeing the woman who had stumbled. Her name, he learned from Nakamura during a brief conversation, was Keiko Hayashi. She'd been a school teacher in Hiroshima before the war, teaching elementary school children reading and mathematics. She'd come to the Philippines in early 1940 to teach at a Japanese school in Manila that served the children of Japanese businessmen and diplomats. When the war broke out in December 1941, she couldn't get home. The shipping lanes were closed. Travel was impossible. She'd spent the war years moving from place to place, hiding in the countryside when the Americans invaded, watching the Japanese military crumble, trying simply to survive another day. She had no family left. Hiroshima had been destroyed by the atomic bomb in August. Everyone she knew, her parents, her younger sister, her aunts and uncles, all gone in a flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns. She'd learned this from another prisoner who had heard it from a Japanese soldier before the surrender. She had no home to return to, nothing waiting for her except ashes and radiation and ghosts. Harper tried not to care. He told himself her suffering was justice. He told himself this was what they deserved. But something about her stuck with him like a splinter he couldn't extract. Maybe it was the way she moved so quietly through the camp, trying to make herself invisible, trying not to be noticed or cause trouble. Or maybe it was the way she helped the older women, sharing her meager rations even though she was clearly starving herself, her clothes hanging off her frame like a scarecrow. Or maybe it was the way she organized the children, keeping them calm and quiet, teaching them little games to pass the time and forget their hunger. Or maybe it was just that she reminded him of his brother's fiancée, a quiet girl named Sarah, who used to bake chocolate chip cookies and leave them on their porch with little notes, who had worn black to Michael's funeral and never married anyone else. One morning, Harper was assigned to help organize a work detail. Some of the prisoners were being put to work repairing the camp's fencing that had been damaged in a storm the previous night. It was light work, mostly just to keep them busy and give them a sense of purpose, something to do besides sit and wait and worry. Keiko was among the workers. She moved slowly, her hands blistered and raw from previous work assignments, but she didn't complain. None of them complained. They'd learned that complaining brought trouble. Harper was supervising, making sure no one wandered off or caused problems. Not that they would. They were too tired, too broken, too afraid. As he walked along the fence line, checking the repairs, he noticed Keiko had stopped working. She was kneeling on the ground about 20 feet away, her finger tracing something in the dirt. Harper approached, his hand instinctively moving toward his rifle, years of training kicking in. But she wasn't trying to signal anyone. She wasn't doing anything threatening. She was just drawing. Harper stopped a few feet away, watching her carefully. The drawing was simple but deliberate. A small house with a sloped roof, the kind you'd see in any Japanese village. A tree next to it, branches spreading wide, and 3 figures standing in front of the house. 2 tall, 1 small. A family. Keiko's finger moved slowly, carefully, as if the drawing was the most precious thing in the world. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and just stared at it. Her face was expressionless, years of practice hiding her emotions, but her hands were shaking. Her whole body was shaking. Harper didn't know what to say. He didn't speak Japanese and she didn't speak English. So he just stood there, this armed American soldier still carrying his hatred like armor, watching a Japanese woman mourn in the only way she could. After a long moment, Keiko looked up at him. She must have sensed his presence. She pointed to the drawing with a trembling finger, then to herself. Then she made a sweeping gesture with both hands, like an explosion, like everything disappearing in an instant. Then she pointed to the drawing again and slowly shook her head. The meaning was clear, transcending language barriers. This was her family. This was her home. This was her life. And it was gone. All of it. Erased. Something cracked inside Harper's chest. It was a small crack, barely noticeable, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. But it was there. He cleared his throat awkwardly and looked away, suddenly uncomfortable with the intimacy of this moment. He said, quiet enough that no one else could hear, that he was sorry. The words felt strange in his mouth. He hadn't said those words about anything related to the Japanese in 4 years. He didn't know if she understood English. But she bowed her head slightly, a small acknowledgement that something had been communicated. Something had passed between them. That night, Harper couldn't sleep. He lay in his cot, staring at the canvas ceiling of his tent, listening to O'Brien snoring in the cot next to him. He kept thinking about the drawing in the dirt. 3 figures, a family, just like his family had been. His mother, his father, himself, and Michael. Except now Michael was gone and the family was incomplete, forever broken. And Harper had spent 4 years hating the people who took him away, dehumanizing them, seeing them as nothing more than targets. But Keiko had lost people too. Everyone in that camp had lost people. The prisoners had lost family members to American bombs, to starvation, to disease. And suddenly, the simple equation he'd lived by for so long, the clear division of us versus them, good versus evil, didn't feel so simple anymore. The lines were blurring and Harper didn't know how to handle it. The next day, Harper found himself watching Keiko more closely, not in a threatening way, or even a suspicious way, more like he was trying to understand something, trying to solve a puzzle that didn't have an obvious answer. She moved through the camp like a ghost, quiet and unobtrusive, helping where she could, staying out of trouble, existing in the small spaces between other people's attention. But Harper saw her now in a way he hadn't before. He saw the way she comforted a crying child who missed her mother, even though Keiko had no food to give, no toys to offer, only gentle words in Japanese, and a soft hand on the child's head. He saw the way she organized the women's sleeping area in one of the damaged school buildings, trying to create some sense of order and dignity in the chaos, arranging sleeping mats so everyone had a space, mediating disputes over the limited resources. He saw the way she stared at the sky sometimes during the brief moments of rest, as if looking for something that wasn't there anymore, as if searching the clouds for the faces of the dead. O'Brien noticed Harper's distraction. During their lunch break, sitting in the shade of a half-destroyed building, he asked if everything was all right. Harper said he was fine, just tired. But he wasn't fine. He was confused, and he was angry at himself for being confused. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to see them as people with lives and families and grief. That made everything he'd done in the war, every enemy he'd killed, every town he'd helped destroy, suddenly questionable, and he didn't want to question it. Questioning it meant facing things he wasn't ready to face. It meant acknowledging that maybe some of the people he'd killed had been like Keiko, just trying to survive, just following orders, just caught in something bigger than themselves. A few days later, there was an incident that put everyone on edge. One of the male prisoners, a former soldier who'd hidden his uniform and tried to blend in with the civilians, attempted to escape. He made it maybe 200 yards before he was caught, terrified and disoriented, not even sure where he was running to. The guards roughed him up a bit, nothing too serious by the standards of war, just enough to make a point and discourage others from trying. But the incident changed the atmosphere in the camp. The prisoners became more fearful, more withdrawn, worried about collective punishment. The guards became more aggressive, more suspicious, looking for other potential troublemakers. Harper found himself in the middle of this tension, not sure which side he was on anymore, not sure what he believed. That evening, as tensions ran high and the camp felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark, Nakamura approached Harper again. His face was more troubled than usual. He said he needed help. One of the women was having a complete breakdown. She'd just learned from a recently arrived group of prisoners that her entire village had been destroyed in an American firebombing raid. Everyone she knew was dead. Her husband, her children, her parents, her neighbors, everyone. The village had been turned to ash and she was the only survivor, and only because she'd been away in Manila when it happened. She was screaming now, inconsolable, making sounds that didn't even seem human anymore. The guards wanted to isolate her, to lock her up in one of the storage sheds until she calmed down, worried that her hysteria would spread to other prisoners. But Nakamura thought that would make things worse. He thought that locking up a traumatized woman in the dark would break her completely. He asked if Harper could help move her somewhere quiet, somewhere away from the other prisoners so they wouldn't be disturbed. But not a cell, just a place where she could grieve without being punished for it. Harper agreed. He didn't know why he agreed. Maybe because Nakamura asked him directly, trusting him. Maybe because he was tired of more pain, more cruelty, more suffering. They found the woman curled up in a corner of the women's sleeping area, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe, her whole body convulsing with grief. The other women had backed away, not out of cruelty, but out of their own fear and helplessness. Nakamura spoke to her softly in Japanese, his voice gentle and calm, trying to reach through the wall of her anguish. Harper just stood there, feeling completely useless, his rifle suddenly feeling like a terrible burden. Eventually, they managed to get her to her feet and walk her slowly to an empty supply tent on the edge of the camp. Nakamura stayed with her, still speaking softly in their shared language, words Harper couldn't understand but whose meaning was clear in their tone. Comfort, compassion, shared humanity. Harper stood outside the tent, listening to the woman's sobs gradually subside into whimpers and then into silence. When Nakamura finally emerged an hour later, he looked exhausted, emotionally drained. He thanked Harper, his voice heavy with weariness. Then he said something that Harper would remember for the rest of his life. He said, "Grief looks the same in every language. It sounds the same. It feels the same. When you lose everything, it doesn't matter what flag you salute or what uniform you wore. The pain is identical." Harper nodded slowly, not trusting himself to speak, afraid that if he opened his mouth, something unexpected might come out. The breaking point came 3 days later. Harper was doing his evening rounds, checking the perimeter as the sun set, when he saw Keiko sitting alone near the fence, her back to him, facing the jungle beyond. She was singing. The song was soft, barely audible, in Japanese. Harper didn't understand the words, couldn't have translated a single syllable, but he understood the melody. It was a lullaby. His mother used to sing a similar tune to Michael when he was little and couldn't sleep after a nightmare. Different words, different language, but the same soothing rhythm, the same gentle rise and fall, meant to calm and comfort. Harper approached slowly, not wanting to startle her, his boots crunching on the gravel. When Keiko heard his footsteps, she stopped singing abruptly and turned, her eyes wide with apprehension. For a moment, they just looked at each other across the few feet of space that separated them. Then Harper did something he hadn't planned, something that would have shocked him a week ago. He sat down on the ground, a few feet away from her, his rifle across his lap. It wasn't proper protocol. Fraternization with prisoners was discouraged at best, forbidden at worst. But Harper didn't care anymore. He was tired of the anger that burned in his chest, tired of the hate that poisoned everything, tired of pretending these people weren't human beings with the same capacity for love and loss that he had. They sat in silence for a long time, maybe 10 minutes, maybe longer. The sun continued its descent, painting the sky in colors that seemed too beautiful for such an ugly world. Then Keiko began to draw again, her finger moving in the dirt between them. This time, she drew more than just her family. She drew an entire world. A school building with windows and a door, children playing in a yard, stick figures with smiling faces, a garden with vegetables growing in neat rows. She drew it all with her finger in the dirt, creating an entire life that no longer existed. Harper watched, transfixed, unable to look away. Each line was a memory. Each shape was something lost. Each image was a piece of her heart laid bare in the dirt. When she finished, she looked at Harper. She pointed to the elaborate drawing, then to her heart, her palm flat against her chest. Then she pointed to him and made a questioning gesture with her hands, a universal sign asking if he understood, asking if he too had lost something. Harper hesitated. He'd never talked about Michael to anyone except O'Brien, and even with O'Brien, the conversations were brief and surface level. But something about this moment, this silent conversation conducted in drawings and gestures, made him want to share, made him need to share. Harper picked up a stick from the ground and began to draw his own picture next to Keiko's. A ship, large and proud, floating on water. He drew it carefully, adding details he remembered from the photographs, from Michael's letters. Then he drew an explosion above it, lines radiating outward representing fire and destruction. Then he drew a figure, small and alone, standing away from the ship. He pointed to the figure, then to himself. Then he pointed to the explosion and shook his head, the gesture meaning gone, lost, dead. Keiko studied the drawing intently, her eyes moving from the ship to the explosion to the lonely figure. When understanding came, when she realized what he was telling her, her expression changed. Not pity, which Harper would have hated. Something deeper. Recognition. The recognition of shared pain. The recognition that grief is grief regardless of which side of the war you are on. Keiko reached out slowly, telegraphing her movement, giving Harper plenty of time to pull away if he wanted. But he didn't pull away. She placed her hand gently on his arm just for a moment, a brief touch that carried more weight than any words could. The gesture said everything that couldn't be spoken. I understand. I'm sorry for your loss. We're the same, you and I. We're both just people who loved someone and lost them. Harper felt his eyes burning, tears threatening to spill over. He blinked hard, refusing to cry in front of a prisoner, in front of the enemy. But the tears came anyway, silent and unstoppable, running down his cheeks. He wiped them away quickly with the back of his hand, embarrassed, feeling like he was betraying something. But Keiko didn't judge. She didn't mock or condemn. She just sat there. This enemy, this stranger, this woman who'd lost everything and everyone, offering the only thing she had left to give: compassion, understanding, shared humanity. After a while, Harper stood up. He needed to finish his rounds. He had duties, responsibilities. But before he left, he looked down at Keiko and said thank you. She didn't understand English, couldn't have translated the words, but she understood the tone, the meaning behind the sounds. She bowed her head slightly in acknowledgement, and Harper walked away, his vision still blurred with tears. That night, Harper wrote a different kind of letter to his mother. For the first time since Michael's death nearly 4 years ago, he told her about his brother directly. He told her about the anger he'd been carrying like a stone in his chest. He told her about the hate that had sustained him through battle after battle. And he told her about a Japanese woman, a former school teacher named Keiko Hayashi, who'd shown him that the enemy wasn't a faceless monster. The enemy was just people. People who'd lost just as much as he had. People who were grieving just like he was. People who sang lullabies to remember their dead children. He didn't know if his mother would understand. He didn't know if she'd forgive him for finding humanity in the people who killed Michael. But he needed to say it. He needed to write it down before the feeling faded, before the anger came back and covered over this fragile new understanding. Over the next few weeks, something fundamental shifted in Harper. He started seeing all the prisoners differently, not as enemies to be guarded and controlled, but as survivors trying to make sense of a world that had been blown apart. He helped where he could. Small things that didn't break any rules, but made life a little easier. An extra ration of water here when no one was looking. Looking the other way when someone took a few extra minutes to rest during work details. Bringing medicine from the dispensary when someone was sick. Protecting the prisoners from the guards who still wanted to take out their anger on convenient targets. O'Brien noticed the change and approved, saying Harper seemed more like his old self. The person he'd been before the war hardened him. Nakamura noticed too and seemed quietly grateful, nodding at Harper with something like respect in his eyes. As for Keiko, Harper didn't speak to her again directly. There was nothing more to say that hadn't already been communicated in that moment by the fence. But sometimes when their paths crossed in the camp, when he was doing his rounds and she was carrying water or helping with food distribution, they would exchange a small nod, a brief acknowledgement that said everything. You see me. I see you. We survived. We understand. Eventually, after weeks that felt like months, the camp began to close down. The war was truly over now. Peace treaties were being signed. Occupation forces were establishing order. Prisoners were being processed and sent back to Japan, or to wherever they had come from, or to wherever they could find a place. Keiko was among those scheduled to return to Japan, even though she had nothing and no one to return to. Harper heard the news from Nakamura one morning over coffee. He wanted to say goodbye properly, wanted to find words for what she'd given him, but he didn't know how. What do you say to someone who changed your entire worldview without speaking a single word? What do you say to someone who taught you how to be human again? On the day Keiko was scheduled to leave, Harper made sure he was assigned to escort duty. He volunteered for it, actually, which surprised his commanding officer. He walked with the group of departing prisoners to the transport trucks that would take them to the port, where they'd board ships back to their destroyed homeland. Keiko was near the back of the group, carrying a small cloth bag that contained everything she owned in the world. A change of clothes, a cup, some crackers saved from rations, nothing else. When she reached the truck, she paused and turned around. She scanned the faces of the American soldiers standing guard until she found Harper. Their eyes met one last time across the distance. Keiko bowed deeply, a formal bow of respect and gratitude, holding it for several seconds. Harper, in a move that shocked the soldiers around him and would probably earn him a reprimand later, bowed back with equal formality and respect. It wasn't much, it was everything. When Keiko climbed into the truck and it drove away in a cloud of dust, Harper stood there long after it disappeared from view, long after the other soldiers had returned to their duties. He stood there feeling something he hadn't felt in years, maybe since before the war started. Peace. Not happiness exactly. The grief was still there. The loss of Michael was still a wound that would never fully heal, but the anger was gone. The hate had burned itself out, and in its place was something quieter, something that felt almost like forgiveness. Years later, decades later, when Harper was an old man with gray hair and grandchildren climbing on his lap, he would tell this story. He kept a piece of paper with him always, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. A paper where he'd recreated the drawing Keiko had made in the dirt that day by the fence. The house, the tree, the three figures. He'd added his own drawing next to it. The ship, the explosion, the lone figure. 2 stories of loss, 2 stories of survival, 2 reminders that war destroys everyone it touches, regardless of which side they're on, regardless of who wins or loses. Harper never saw Keiko again. He tried to find her after the war, writing letters to organizations that helped displaced persons, but Japan was in chaos and records were scattered or destroyed. He didn't know if she survived the journey home. He didn't know if she found any relatives alive in the ruins of Hiroshima. He didn't know if she rebuilt her life or if the losses were too great. But he hoped she did. He hoped she found peace, just as she'd helped him find it. Because in the end, that's what the drawing meant. That's what that silent conversation in the dirt of a prisoner of war camp taught him. That beneath the uniforms and the flags and the propaganda and the hate, we're all just people trying to protect the ones we love. And when we lose them, when they're torn away by war or disease or time, we all grieve in the same way. We all draw the same pictures in the dirt. We all sing the same lullabies in the dark. The war taught Harper how to hate. It taught him how to kill without thinking. It taught him how to see other people as less than human. But a Japanese woman who didn't speak a word of English, who had lost everything, who had every reason to hate him in return, taught him how to heal. She taught him that compassion doesn't require a shared language. She taught him that humanity transcends nationality. She taught him that the only way to survive the aftermath of war is to remember that your enemy's grief is as real as your own. And that lesson, drawn in the dirt of a prisoner of war camp in the Philippines in September 1945, stayed with Daniel Harper for the rest of his life. It shaped how he raised his children. It influenced how he treated everyone he met. It was the reason he became a teacher after the war, trying to pass on understanding to the next generation. It was the reason he marched for civil rights in the 1960s. It was the reason he protested the Vietnam War. It was the reason he never stopped believing that people, even in their darkest moments, even in the middle of humanity's worst impulses, can still find ways to see each other, to understand each other, to save each other. If you found this story moving, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history that remind us of our shared humanity. Hit the like button if this touched your heart, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how we can learn from the past. What would you have done in Harper's position? How do we find compassion in times of conflict? We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for watching. And remember, history isn't just about battles and dates and political decisions. It's about the human moments that connect us all. The small acts of kindness that survive even when everything else is destroyed. The drawings in the dirt that change everything.